I don't know why I was so nervous. Maybe because it had been a while, too long, really, since I felt genuinely excited about meeting someone. Chase and I had been talking for weeks, long, winding conversations that made me feel seen again. I liked that. So when we finally set the date, I went into full-on prep mode. Skipped dinner, lost track of time. I was so wrapped up in choosing the right dress and calming the storm in my chest that I didn't even realize how late it had gotten. By the time I grabbed my keys and bolted out the door, my heart was pounding for all the wrong reasons. My heels clicked against the pavement like they were warning me to slow down, but I didn't listen. I was already late, already behind, and the anxiety was rising in my throat like a wave I couldn't swallow. And then, everything tilted. The sky, the ground, my balance. My knees buckled before I even made it to the car. Next thing I knew, I was on the ground, blinking up at the fading light. Someone called my name. I think it was Mr. Langston, my neighbor from 2 doors down. I could hear him panicking, asking me if I was okay, then yelling for help. I remember trying to tell him I was fine, but my lips didn't quite cooperate. I managed to fumble for my phone, and with a hand that didn't stop shaking, I typed out a message to Chase. "I'm really sorry. Something happened. I'm heading to the hospital. Maybe we can try another day." He never replied. The ER smelled like bleach and urgency. Everything was too bright. The lights, the beeping machines, the worried faces passing by. I sat there on the gurney, clutching my phone like it could anchor me, even though Chase still hadn't responded. Left on red. That little scene mark was colder than the IV taped to my arm. Maybe it was the low blood sugar, or maybe it was just the familiar ache of feeling like I'd cared more than the other person again. Either way, it stung. They ran tests. Blood pressure, heart rate, a glucose check. Nothing life-threatening, just a mix of exhaustion, dehydration, and what the nurse gently called overexertion. I translated it to, "You were too anxious and forgot to eat again." Typical. As I lay back, trying to catch my breath and pretend like none of this was humiliating, a new face entered the room. Calm, steady, with kind eyes behind her glasses. Dr. Elise Monroe. She introduced herself with a soft voice that cut through the noise in a way I didn't know I needed. She didn't just ask about my symptoms, she asked about me, where I was going tonight, if I lived alone, if I had support. I told her I was supposed to be on a date, but the universe had other plans. She laughed gently and said, "Maybe the universe just needed you to slow down tonight." It didn't feel like judgment. It felt like someone seeing through me and choosing not to look away. I didn't expect to feel safe in that sterile room, but somehow I did. We talked while I rested, not just about the medical stuff, but real things. Elise had this way of making me forget where I was. She told me her shift was ending soon, and that her husband was picking her up for dinner. I smiled, half joking. At least one of us is getting a decent meal tonight. She grinned back and said he'd promised sushi and a bottle of cheap red wine, which made me laugh. There was something so effortless about the way she spoke of him, not like a fairy tale, but like home. It made me ache a little, in that place you don't show people. When I mentioned Chase, I tried to keep it light. I said it wasn't serious yet, that it was just a first date, and maybe it wasn't meant to be. "I guess the universe had other plans," I said, trying to laugh it off, even though a small part of me hated that I still checked my phone. Elise nodded, placing a warm hand on my arm like she understood more than she let on. And maybe she did. Maybe women like us always sense the undertow before the wave hits. The tests were done, and I was feeling better, but I didn't rush to leave. Elise said her husband was just minutes away and asked if I wanted to wait with her until he arrived, just to be sure I was steady. I agreed, partly because she was being thoughtful, and partly because for the first time that night, I didn't feel so alone. There was a quiet rhythm to the hospital room once the chaos settled, just the hum of machines and the soft tapping of Dr. Elise's pen against her clipboard. She stayed near me, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. You could feel that about her, the kind of woman who carried calm like perfume, subtle, steady, comforting. I hadn't realized how starved I was for that kind of presence until I was sitting under those harsh hospital lights, talking about anything but what had just happened. She asked me about my life in that gentle, meandering way that makes you forget you're technically a patient. I told her about my freelance work, my garden, the dog I had to rehome after my last breakup, the little markers of rebuilding. She listened like none of it was small talk, like every sentence mattered. I found myself telling her more than I expected to, maybe because she looked me in the eyes without flinching, or maybe because I'd forgotten what it felt like to be heard without being interrupted. Then she told me about her own night ahead, how her husband, who'd been traveling for work, was meeting her outside to take her to their favorite little place. Nothing fancy, just a spot they went to when life got too loud. He always orders something spicy and then regrets it halfway through. She chuckled, eyes bright. The way she said it, it was simple, but it sounded like a ritual, a love worn in, not worn out. I smiled and said, "He sounds like a keeper." And I meant it. Elise laughed softly and nodded, her voice taking on that warm, nostalgic tone people get when they speak about someone who's shaped their life. "We've had our moments," she admitted, "but he's my best friend." Still surprises me, after all these years. There was something beautiful in the way she said it. Not performative, not polished, just honest. And that kind of honesty, it's magnetic when you've been through enough disappointments to recognize the real thing when it shows up. She stood to check my chart, made a quick note, and then pulled the blanket up gently around my shoulders. A small gesture, but it hit me like a wave. It wasn't about the cold. It was about being cared for. Something I hadn't really let myself want in a long time. "You'll be just fine," she said, with a voice like chamomile tea. "Your heart just needed a reminder to slow down." And maybe that was true. Maybe this wasn't a breakdown, but a pause I didn't know I needed. I told her I was embarrassed, about the fall, about texting a guy who didn't bother to answer, about hoping for something I should have known better than to expect. She just shook her head gently. "Don't ever feel silly for hoping," she said. "Hope is brave and messy, but it's never foolish." For a moment, the tight knot in my chest loosened. I didn't realize it until it was gone. It felt like someone had cracked open a window I'd nailed shut years ago, letting just a little air in. We sat in that quiet little room, two women in completely different stages of life, yet strangely aligned. There was a softness to the moment, not just in her voice, but in her presence. Like she'd made space for me without needing anything in return. And I didn't even realize how much I'd needed it. We spoke about everything and nothing. The places we once dreamed of living, the way people change when they're in love, or when they stop being loved the way they deserve. At one point, I asked her how she knew her husband was the one. She smiled like it wasn't the first time she'd been asked that question, but maybe the first time in a while. "He showed up when it mattered," she said, "and when he couldn't fix something, he just sat with me in the dark." There was something so quiet and powerful in that. Not dramatic gestures, not grand speeches, just presence. I felt that truth settle in my bones like an old story I'd forgotten I knew. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced down, smiled, and said, "That's him. He's waiting just outside." I smiled back, not ready to say goodbye just yet. She asked if I'd like to sit with her for a few more minutes just until I felt steady enough to leave. I nodded. I didn't want to be alone yet. Something about the way she was watching that door, relaxed, expectant, trusting, made me curious. Curious about what it looks like when love isn't confusing or painful, when it's just there. The door opened gently, like any ordinary entrance, but nothing that followed was ordinary. Elise turned with that warm glow still on her face, the kind of look that comes from love well kept. "There he is," she said with a soft smile, rising to greet her husband. I followed her gaze instinctively, expecting some harmless middle-aged man with kind eyes and a goofy smile. Instead, my stomach clenched. It was Chase. Standing there, holding a takeout bag in one hand, confusion flashing across his face like a bad actor forgetting his lines. His eyes darted from Elise to me, then back again. And in that split second, I saw it all. The recognition, the panic, the silent calculation of what he could say to untangle himself from this moment. Elise hadn't noticed. Not yet. She was still smiling, still walking toward him, but I didn't move. I couldn't. My heart wasn't pounding. It was sinking. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Elise turned halfway and noticed my expression. "Wait, you two know each other?" she asked, brow furrowed, sensing the sudden shift in the air. I forced a breath. My hands were shaking, but I willed them still. My voice came out softer than I expected, calm even. "We were supposed to have dinner tonight," I said, eyes locked on his. "Your husband's quite the multitasker." The words hung in the air like smoke, curling into the silence between us. Elise stopped in her tracks, her expression crumbling in slow motion, confusion melting into realization. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. Just her eyes, scanning Chase's face for some kind of mistake, some misunderstanding. But there wasn't one. You could see it in the way he stood frozen, his usual charm drained completely. He looked like a man caught between two fires, unsure of which one would burn slower. He stumbled forward, reaching toward Elise. "Elle, listen, this isn't what it looks like," he began, but the lie barely left his mouth before it fell apart. She didn't move, didn't flinch, just looked at him with a stillness that was far more terrifying than anger. She turned to me, her voice barely above a whisper. "You were going to meet him?" I nodded once, and I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, not from shame, but from the fury I was swallowing whole. Chase fumbled again, this time trying to make it sound small. "It was nothing, just conversation, a distraction. I didn't even think it would go anywhere." That last part landed like a punch I wasn't expecting. I watched Elise's jaw tighten, her breath shallow. Her eyes weren't wet, not yet, but they looked like they were preparing to be. I stayed quiet, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because I knew this wasn't my moment to speak. This was her battlefield now. Elise took a small step back, as if needing physical distance to process what her heart couldn't. Her arms wrapped around herself, not for warmth, but protection. You could see the wheels turning, trying to reconcile the man she had just spoken about with pride and affection, with the man standing in front of her now, exposed. "You lied to both of us," she said quietly. "And for what? A thrill?" Her voice wasn't raised, but it cut through him clean. Chase reached for her again, desperate now. "It didn't mean anything, Elise. I was just bored. I needed something different. It was stupid, I know." He glanced at me like I might vouch for him, as if we'd shared anything real. I met his gaze without blinking. If he was hoping for mercy, he was looking in the wrong direction. And then he whispered, barely audible, "Please don't make this worse." I stood up slowly. Not for drama, for clarity. I turned to Elise, who looked like she might break, and said calmly, "Worse? No. I think I just made it better. For her." That moment, right there, wasn't about revenge. It was about truth slipping its way into the room, uninvited but undeniable. And as Elise looked back at Chase, at this man who had worn two faces and thought no one would notice, I saw something change in her, a door inside her quietly closing. Elise didn't scream. She didn't throw anything or collapse into sobs the way television tells you heartbreak should look. No, she just turned away from him, slowly, like someone stepping away from a fire they no longer wanted to warm their hands by. The silence was louder than any outburst could have been. She walked out of the room with her head high, but her shoulders, they carried weight now, the weight of knowing. Chase started to go after her, but I moved to stand between them. Not out of spite, but instinct. I wasn't going to let him chase her pain down the hallway like it was something he could fix with more words. He stopped, defeated, and then turned to me. His voice dropped, desperate and pathetic. "You didn't have to say it like that," he muttered, like the truth was somehow the crime here, like his web wasn't already collapsing around him. I raised an eyebrow and let the silence speak for itself. Then finally I said, "You made 2 dinner plans, Chase. Only one of us showed up honest." That's when he looked away, not because I'd shouted or shamed him, but because the truth, when spoken plainly, has a way of making cowards flinch. He looked so small then, so unlike the version of him I'd built up in texts and photos and flirty emoji-strewn banter. Funny how clarity strips everything down to size. He lingered for a moment longer, like he thought there was still a version of this that could be salvaged. "You don't understand," he said, barely meeting my eyes. "My marriage? It's been hard. I needed a break. Just someone to talk to. You were just supposed to be... I don't know." The way he said it, just someone, like I was a placeholder in his boredom, made something inside me harden, not from hurt, from clarity. That sharp moment when you realize your worth was never part of their calculation. "You needed a break?" I said, voice low, steady. "So you logged into a dating app and lied to 2 women in one breath?" He didn't answer. Just looked away again, chewing the inside of his cheek like it might hold back the shame. I wasn't interested in watching him unravel. I was only interested in the lesson this moment carried. Not for him, but for me. That sometimes people show up wearing masks, and if you're not careful, you'll mistake the costume for their character. He tried once more, softer this time. "Look, I didn't want to hurt anyone." I cut in before he could finish. "But you did, and not just her. You hurt someone you hadn't even met yet. Do you know how rare it is for someone to hope again? To open the door just a crack and let someone in?" He didn't have an answer for that either. He just stood there, silent, while I gathered my bag. The irony of it all, this man who was supposed to be my date, now just another disappointment under fluorescent lights. The hallway outside the room was quiet, except for the soft squeak of nurses' shoes and the distant hum of machines. I spotted Elise standing near the vending machines, arms crossed, eyes fixed on nothing. She didn't look broken. She looked like someone doing the quiet math of a life rebalanced in a single moment. I didn't say anything at first. I just stood beside her, offering the kind of silence that says, "I see you. I'm not going anywhere." Sometimes, that's all we have to give. After a beat, she spoke. "I should have seen it," she said, voice steady but tired. "The long trips, the change in passwords, the way he smiled less." I shook my head gently. "You gave him the benefit of the doubt. That's not a flaw, Elise. That's love." She exhaled like the words had touched a nerve. Then she looked at me, really looked. And I saw gratitude, but also something else. A quiet rage, carefully folded, tucked beneath her ribs like a sharp object she hadn't yet decided what to do with. "I don't know what happens next," she said. "I just know I won't let him explain this away with tired excuses." I nodded, and before I could reply, Chase appeared at the far end of the hallway. He didn't approach this time, just watched us. Waiting, maybe. Hoping. Elise met his eyes with something that resembled grace. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But grace. Then she turned her back to him. Just like that. And in that moment, I knew. She was done letting him occupy space he no longer deserved. A week passed, quiet and unremarkable on the surface. But underneath, something was shifting. In me. In her. In the space that betrayal had left behind. I'd gone back to my routines, kind of. The morning coffee, the inbox, the silence of my apartment, now less lonely and more peaceful. I hadn't heard from Chase, and I didn't expect to. He'd vanished like a man who finally saw himself for what he was. But then one morning, a message buzzed on my phone, from Elise. It was short, but precise. "Thank you, I filed for divorce. And no, he's not unemployed, just referred to therapy." I stared at the screen and laughed, not cruelly, but with the kind of release that only comes when justice shows up wearing quiet shoes. No drama, no fireworks, just a woman reclaiming her time, her name, and her future. It wasn't revenge in the traditional sense. It was sharper, smarter, It was choosing dignity when everything screamed for chaos. That morning, I got dressed a little slower. I wore the lipstick I had planned to wear on that date. I walked to the cafe near my building, the one with the flaky croissants and the window seat that caught the late morning sun. I didn't bring a book. I didn't scroll my phone. I just sat there, watching life move around me. Not waiting for anyone, not hoping to be noticed, just present, whole, and surprisingly, content. The kind of peace that doesn't ask for permission. The barista, a college kid with a shy smile, slid my coffee across the counter and said, "You look like you've got good news." I smiled and tilted my head. Something like that. It wasn't the kind of good news you post online or tell everyone about. It was quieter than that. A kind of internal triumph. The knowledge that I had stepped into something painful and walked out stronger, not bitter. There was power in knowing I hadn't begged, hadn't stooped, hadn't clung to someone who wasn't worthy of my story. I thought about Elise a lot that day, about the grace she showed in the middle of that disaster, about how she chose truth over comfort, how she didn't chase answers. She made decisions. That's a woman's kind of strength. Quiet, unshakable, the kind of strength that doesn't make noise, but makes waves. I imagined her somewhere far from that hospital room, maybe signing a paper that set her free, or sitting in her own kitchen, drinking tea in silence, finally breathing without suspicion. And me? I wasn't angry anymore, just awake. I could still remember how my hands trembled that night, how humiliation had curled in my gut like a fist. But now, all I felt was distance from that moment. Not detachment, just clarity. That night didn't define me. If anything, it revealed me. I had stayed kind when I could have been cruel. I had spoken truth instead of letting it rot inside me. I didn't win anything that night, but I didn't lose myself either. And that, I think, is its own kind of justice. I stayed at that cafe longer than I planned. Watched the light shift through the windows. Watched strangers come and go, unaware of the small, quiet victory unfolding at that little corner table. And when I finally stood up to leave, I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel like something had been taken from me. If anything, I felt returned. To myself. To the woman who, even in her most fragile moment, held her ground with quiet dignity. There was no big finish, no movie ending, just a woman walking home alone, heart intact, head high, and no text left unread. No revenge plotted, no apology needed. Just the kind of ending that feels like a beginning. The kind that doesn't need an audience to be powerful. I paused for a moment outside my building, took a deep breath, and smiled to myself. The air felt different, not because the world had changed, but because I had. And as I turned the key in my front door, I could still hear Elise's message echoing in my head. She hadn't needed to shout to be heard. She hadn't needed to fight to be free, and neither had I. Because sometimes the truth, delivered calmly, precisely, and at the perfect moment, is the sharpest form of revenge. She didn't need to destroy him. The truth did the work for her,